Okay, in this video, you're going to learn how to compute a particular operation on our matrix. So we're going to learn about the pivot operation. And when we pivot, we're performing an operation on an entire matrix, so it's a little different. Already in the past, we did learn about our 3-row operations. We can swap any 2 rows. We can multiply a row by a non-zero number, or we can add 2 rows together, 1 row plus the multiple of another row. The pivot operation, really the first step is going to be to identify the pivot element. Now, in this section, section 1, the pivot element is going to be told to us. Like when you approach the homework, it's going to be highlighted. They're going to say, here's the number in the matrix that I want you to use as the pivot element. When we go into the simplex method in the last section that we're going to cover in this chapter, then I will discuss how you choose where the pivot element is. But for right now, it's going to be told to you. Once you know where the pivot element is, the operation is to pivot the whole matrix around that element, meaning create a 1 where that element is and zeros elsewhere in the row column. So to sort of summarize in writing here, you may want to pause the screen if you want to copy this down. You're going to identify where the pivot element is in general, but for today, for this section, we have our pivot element identified for us in each problem. Then that number in your matrix, whatever row that number is in, is called the pivot row. Whatever column it is in is called the pivot column. Now the pivot row, we want to create a 1 where the pivot element is. So we can divide the entire row by the number that is our pivot element. It's the same thing as multiplying by its reciprocal. So we are allowed to do it because we're allowed to multiply any row by a number that's not 0. This will make a 1 where our pivot element is. Then we use row operation like this row operation where we're adding a row plus a multiple of another row, a non-zero multiple. We're going to use the pivot row as that non-zero multiple. So in the way I've written this example, this is my pivot row. And we're going to use this sort of operation to make zeros everywhere else in the column. So it's similar to what we were doing when we were looking to make reduced row echelon form. We want zeros above and below everywhere else in the column. So I'm going to put an example matrix up here with the pivot element already identified for us. And then we will work on how to pivot around that element. And in case you're wondering, like, okay, so but when I'm done, what does the answer look like? This is going to be one step of the simplex method that we're working towards, we're building our skills for. So when you're done pivoting the matrix, you still have a matrix as your final result. You still have a whole matrix. The thing that will be different is the particular element you chose or were told about, identified as the pivot element, is now a 1, and everything else in that column is zeros besides that 1. So we still will have a matrix in the end. So I'm going to put an example up here, and we will work through pivoting it. So this is our initial simplex tableau for the example where we had toy cars being made. Right, we had toy cars being made. There were 2 models, a deluxe and a standard model. And the standard model required 2 hours on the grinding machine and 2 hours on the finishing machine. And it gave us a profit of $3. And our deluxe model, we had similar information. And we had total number of hours that we were able to use up for grinding and finishing from our employees. And we introduce slack variables, all of those things. So I've worked with this example quite a bit in class. We have our basic variables. Remember, basic variables are variables where there's a 0 in every entry except for a 1 in one spot. So our S2, slack variable 2, has a 1 in the second row and zeros elsewhere. So our second row gets labeled S2, slack 2. Slack 1 had a 1 in the top row and zeros elsewhere. So our top row is labeled with S1 as its basic variable. And our profit has zeros elsewhere, but a 1 in the bottom row. So our bottom row gets labeled the profit. That property of being a 1 in all zeros is not true for any of our other variables here, not our right-hand side, not our x1 or x2. So let's say we were asked to pivot specifically around this element here, the number 4, that is found in the first row, third column. So we are going to be looking to pivot. The pivot column is the X2 column, and the pivot row is the S1 row. So our pivot element has been identified. So our next step is to divide the entire row by that number. So we're going to divide everything in the top row by 4, or our row operation, if we want to write it out, would be that the new row 1 is going to equal the old row 1, and instead of saying divided by 4, we say times 1/4 times the reciprocal. So we'll compute that row operation and replace row 1 by our result from dividing everything by 4. And I'm going to strongly recommend keeping your labeling consistent. So I would say right now, pause the video, copy down your matrix, and replace that top row. Copy the column headings, but wait to fill in the basic variables, because we have to look and see what rows are labeled as which, based on which are, by definition, basic variables. Okay, so I have copied just everything but my top row and the labels for my column. So we're going to divide everything in the top row by 4. So 0 divided by 4 is 0. 2 divided by 4 is 1/2. 4 divided by 4 is 1, which is great because I want to get a 1 in this place. Then my next step will be to get zeros everywhere else in that column. 1 divided by 1. But 1 times 1/4 is 1/4. 0 divided by 4 is 0. And 120 divided by 4 is 30. So I've done all the steps to obtain a 1 in that place. Next, our last step for pivoting is going to be obtaining zeros everywhere else in that column. So in my X2 column, I want a 0 where there's currently a 2 and where there's currently a -4. So I can use my row operations involving the pivot row. So it's important that I involve this top row. So to change row 2, to make a 0 here, I'm going to add the current row 2 plus -2 times row 1. 2 plus -2 times 1 will make a 0. And for the bottom row, I'm going to replace the third row using the current third row plus, it currently is a -4, so I'm going to use 4 times row 1. Remember, when we're trying to make zeros, I tried to point this out earlier in chapter 2, that we use the opposite. We just change the sign and we multiply times the row that has a 1 in that spot already. So we're still doing that same process. So again, I will copy in my matrix. The first row I'm not changing in this step. 0, 1/2, 1, 1/4, 0, and 30. It's my P, X1, X2, slack 1, slack 2, and the right-hand side. But the rest of the matrix is going to change the way that it looks because I'm performing these row operations. Okay, so in row 2, I'm adding row 2 plus -2 times row 1. So 0 plus -2 times 0 is still 0. That horizontal bar. Then we have 2 plus -2 times 1/2. 2 plus -2 times 1/2. -2 times 1/2 is -1 plus 2 makes 1. Then we go to the next entry. That's 2 plus -2 times 1, which is 0. Then we move forward. We say 0 plus -2 times 1/4. -2 times 1/4 is -1/2. Then we're in the S2 column, so 1 plus -2 times 0, which is 1. And then 80 plus -2 times 30. That's -60, so we come out with 20 when we add those together. So if you're struggling to keep up with where I'm getting each of these numbers, you might want to pause the video, rewind it a little bit, and see if you follow along with me. Also, it may help to pause the video now and then see what I have for the bottom row. Do the bottom row on your own and then press play. So for row 3, we're adding row 3 plus 4 times row 1. So 1 plus 4 times 0 is 1. -3 plus 4 times 1/2. That's 4 times 1/2 is 2. Plus -3 makes -1. -4 plus 4 times 1 is 0. 0 plus 4 times 1/4, that's 1. 0 plus 0 times 4 is 0. And 0 plus 4 times 30 is 120. So hopefully this is what your matrix looks like after performing the row operations. We have pivoted now. We have made a 1 where we wanted a 1 to be. The top entry, remember our pivot element was this top entry. It originally was a 4, but now it's a 1. And everything else in that column is now a 0. So we've completely pivoted. We should identify what our basic variable labels are. So when we're looking to identify, so we can label our rows, when we want to identify the basic variable labels, we look for columns where there's all zeros except for one of the entries is the number 1. So our P column has that property still, 0, 0, 1. And because the 1 is in the third row, our third row gets a label of P. Our pivot column has that as well, our X2. We've got a 1 in the top row and zeros elsewhere. So the top row is now labeled X2 rather than slack variable 1 as it was in the beginning. And then lastly, our slack variable 2 has that property, and the 1 is found in the second row. So this matrix has been pivoted where indicated. I am going to also talk about how to analyze this result, how to read the tableau. What is this telling me? But I am going to make a separate video for that. So this is just how you pivot around a single element. You can do this for any matrix. I'm going to do different examples in class, although I may reference this example as well.